Right. Thank you for.
All right, I'm recording, so you should all have received a notification, right, Frank? All right. So Kinsey, to you.
Yeah. So Kasey Yturralde works with the Urban Forestry Division, a part of the District Department of Transportation in Washington, D.C. She serves as the Forest Health and Community Outreach Specialist. Previously, she worked for 3 years as an urban forester, also with the Urban Forestry Division. Her work there includes leading forest health monitoring activities and studies, as well as coordinating outreach in city parks and schools to increase awareness of trees and the benefits they provide. Kasey holds a PhD in forest science from Northern Arizona University, where she studied acoustic communication in bark beetles. Very interesting topic. So with that, Kasey, if you'd like to share your screen, take it away. We're excited to hear all you have to say.
Great, thank you. Okay. How does that look? Good, okay. Great, well, so thank you so much for inviting me, and gosh, I'm gonna move all these like controls around here so I can see. Okay. So I work for Urban Forestry Division here in the District of Columbia as the Forest Health and Community Outreach Specialist. And so today I'm going to talk about what we have been doing to address climate change and kind of when we first started initially thinking about how to approach it and what kind of path we took. Okay, so just a brief outline. So I'll just talk generally about climate change in urban forests and why we should care, and then discuss impacts that we can expect here in the Mid-Atlantic region, and then go into the what we can expect here in the District of Columbia, and then get into the kind of really focus, which is how we are addressing and thinking about climate change in our urban forest management. What is it at risk, and what kind of work have we done to date? And then mostly let's have a lot of work in progress as well. And then a discussion of like some kind of what's on the horizon. Gosh, this little menu bar is like up there, okay. So why should we consider climate change in urban forestry? Well, for so many reasons. So trees are important in climate change mitigation and adaptation, and then they are themselves impacted by climate change. So mitigation refers to actions that are taken to reduce or avoid greenhouse gas emitting or heat trapping greenhouse gases. And then adaptation refers to actions that try to reduce the impacts of climate change. And trees are amazing because they can do all of this together. But we do have to think of the fact that they are, living organisms, and they are themselves going to be impacted by climate change. And that's going to change, how we live in cities. And, we, as urban foresters and practitioners, we're always talking about the benefits of trees. But, we need to think about the fact that climate change could impact them so adversely that we might not get to enjoy those benefits. So it's important to think of that as well. And a lot of people have already been doing work. And so I'm going to be referring to work that the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Sciences has been doing and also with the Forest Service. So Leslie Brandt and her colleagues published this paper on vulnerability of the urban forest in Chicago. And this just shows the breakdown of vulnerability to climate change of their trees in different neighborhoods. And so, some are going to fare well and some not so much. So this is something that we want to think about. And so what is at risk? actually, let's talk about the mitigation. So the benefits of trees in a changing climate. So this is another nice resource that I am borrowing from the NIAX website. And I like this infographic because it shows the mitigation. So trees are amazing because they can take in carbon and then also reduce the need for energy use because they provide reduced heating and cooling. And then on the other side, you have adaptation. So they help us adapt to climate change because they help cool our neighborhoods, they provide shade, they help reduce and control stormwater during these intense precipitation events. And so in addition to trees, being at risk with climate change, human health is at risk. And this is something that I think is important to us as well, because we are humans, but also because we're managing the urban forest for people, right? So we live in a city, we're managing the trees to improve the lives of residents and our neighbors. And we will be at risk because of heat emergencies, extreme heat. And so in terms of weather and natural disasters, heat is the #1 killer. And so we also need to think that this has really important implications, having trees and tree canopy. And so this infographic is just an example of the heat emergency activation that happens here in DC. So when the heat index gets above 95 degrees, we open cooling centers, and that's the time to kind of check in on neighbors. And then also you have to consider who's at risk. So I shared that map of DC that showed, and I'll show it again, but it showed kind of the urban heat island effect. So it showed the warming across the city on an August afternoon in 2018. And there's a difference of 17 degrees depending on where you live in the city. So the risk that we experience differs just basically depending on where we live, but also there's a lot of demographic factors that change our vulnerability or impact our vulnerability. So if you're low income, it's harder for you to, maybe you don't have air conditioning, or it's harder to justify using it because it's expensive. And all sorts of other factors, race, as well as health. So if you have poor health, then you're going to be more vulnerable to these intense heat events. And then age as well. And so there's lots of different things that come into, there's heat exposure, but then you have the vulnerability as well. And so we want to think about that when we consider where we plant trees and where they needed most. And so I'll talk about climate change kind of in the Mid-Atlantic, and there's a lot of text. So just focus on like the bright white words there. So basically in the Mid-Atlantic, we're expecting an increase in average temperatures of up to 9 degrees by the end of the century. And forest vegetation will be impacted. So there will be longer periods of drought and more intense drought. And also intense precipitation events. So I think someone was just talking about that right before. And those intense precipitation and rain events are going to be more frequent. So there are some changes that we could anticipate in the Mid-Atlantic, which is that we could have an increase, and we could have new species to our area, say from the south, that might fare well in our future climate. And so there's not everything is entirely kind of bad news, but that, and I'm just referring to that photo there showing, and this is from the U.S. Forest Service Tree Atlas, and it shows in black, that's a current distribution of sugarberry, and then depending on the kind of emission scenarios in the future, we can expect that habitat suitability to change, and you could have sugarberry growing very well. So, and then sea level rise. So we'll definitely be seeing sea level rise, and it's something that we see now. So this example is from the Maryland Department of Agriculture, their forest health highlights that you can find online. And this is from 2016, but this is the Eastern Shore. And what you can see here are forested areas and then polygons that indicate mortality, so damage from saltwater intrusion. And so it's severe, mostly severe to moderate, and then very severe. And unfortunately, also in a lot of these areas where you have saltwater intrusion, you have infestations of pests. And so the southern pine beetle, there have been outbreaks in these areas as well, which kind of guarantees mortality in these trees. And so for here in the District of Columbia, I'm just going to focus on kind of the heat and then precipitation. And all of this is, so we have this really great resource from the Department of Energy and the Environment. They developed the Climate Ready DC plan and have updated it with our progress. And so all of this is basically from their work. But the average high temperature in the summer, 87 degrees, could reach 97 degrees, so 10 degrees increase. And you can see that in the figure there. So in black, that shows average high summer temperatures around 87. And then depending on the emission scenario, you can get up to, in the high range, 80 or 97 degrees. And so, I refer to that heat emergency, and we unfortunately will have more of these extreme heat days and heat waves that will last longer. And so areas here that experience urban heat island effects, so I'll show that figure again. It will be that heat that we experience if you are in one of those areas, it'll be exacerbated and kind of amplified with this change in climate. And so precipitation in the district, this is a figure or photograph showing the tidal basin and high tide and bench kind of underwater there. And so there's a little bit less kind of the precipitation, the events that we can expect. There's a little bit less, more uncertainty around precipitation as compared to heat. But we do know that there will be both an increase in intensity and frequency. It's hard to know like what the pattern will be, when that will occur and that sort of thing, except that we know we'll get more concentrated kind of precipitation events. And so this increased rainfall could result in damage to from flooding to property and infrastructure, including trees. And it's something that we've already seen happen. So 3 years ago in 2018 in July, we had a really intense rain event. And so this could impact your just daily life, like kind of what you're doing to get to work, your commute. So this is a photograph on Canal Road. Whether you're driving or taking the metro, with this flooding in the metro, you could definitely feel those impacts in terms of these intense precipitation events. And then relating it to trees, which is kind of what we're here to talk about. So there will be increased stress from kind of multiple angles. So there'll be drought, so extended periods without rain. And we've already had one of those this year. And then, so extreme heat, extreme weather events, storms, and you could see changes in trees in terms of phenology. So the timing of events, so leafing out earlier, premature bud break, and then you can get increased growth rates in trees and potentially more severe pest outbreaks or incidences of pathogens as well. So the southern pine beetle is an example of that with saltwater intrusion in the Eastern Shore of Maryland. And so this is that map that I was referring to. And I just wanted to show that in the deep red sections here, the extreme temperature was about 102 that day. And then in the dark green, say Rock Creek Park, some of the other areas here, temperatures were as low as 85 degrees. So you have a difference of like 17 degrees and due to the urban heat island effect. So it can really change, the quality of your life depending on where you live and depending on your vulnerability. And so we are interested in addressing climate change and what we do. And, early on in 2018, we were able to access this heat mapping that was done by professor and researchers from Portland State and NOAA. And so we were able to access that data and incorporate it into maps that we use to manage trees. And so we were able to use that urban heat island data to prioritize where we're planting trees and planting them, prioritizing planting them in the hottest neighborhoods. So that's just an example here showing, planned plantings and then open spaces where we could plant trees. So we've been doing that for a couple years, but as I said, the urban heat island effect and urban warming, the way that you experience that will differ depending on where you live, because obviously you can see here there's a big difference in temperature across the district. But Department of Energy and the Environment has also considered, in addition to heat exposure, the kind of sensitivity or vulnerability. And so they came up with this heat sensitivity index, and that's what you see the map of DC in purple. And so heat risk incorporates all these different factors, incorporates what you're actually exposed to in terms of the heat, and then how sensitive you are to that in terms of your income. So can you afford air conditioning, race, health conditions, asthma, heart disease, and then tree canopy. And so this is from their 2020 report, Climate Ready DC report. And so what you can see here is that, we want to know in these high risk areas where there's high heat sensitivity, how are we doing? And so we definitely have some work to do there. It shows tree canopy and then increase in trees. So we have seen an increase in the urban tree canopy in these areas. There's and that is in part due to tree planting efforts. So we have on the right that shows the cumulative number of trees that we've planted across the city, and it's somewhat of a good match of where that heat sensitivity is. So that's the way that we've been addressing climate change is where we plant and numbers of trees that we're planting. And so we want to also ask not just where are we planting, but what are we planting? And are we planting the right complement of trees that will perform well and provide benefits? And so we've thought, we can think of the urban trees in DC in kind of 3 different categories. So we have the street trees where we have a full inventory, and that's what that figure shows there. That's an area just north of the National Mall. And then park and school trees, which we also directly manage. And we were given purview over those trees in 2016. So we're still building that inventory. It's quite good, but we're still kind of working on that. And then comprehensively, the urban forest, we can look at that forest composition using urban forest inventory and analysis when those data are available. So I'll just focus on the street trees. We kind of have focused on that because we know all of those trees and they're updated frequently. And so I mentioned the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. We've worked with them quite a lot, and they've been really generous with their time and what they have provided for us. And so we worked with them in 2 different ways to look at our street tree population. The first is that we provided a list of our tree species to them, and then they ranked them, provided rankings that indicate climate vulnerability. And so now we have a good portion of our inventory that we can look at and evaluate related to climate vulnerability to climate change. And then the other is that they have a training that is online, adaptation workbook training that really is quite nice. And we did that last year. So I'll talk about the first, which is the list of our trees and the information they provided us. So we have urban trees here. So this is a slightly different source of data compared to the tree atlas. So the tree atlas you can use from the Forest Service, and it'll show you changes in habitat suitability in future, depending on the emission scenario. And this is a bit different. And so what they've done is they provided us for kind of these landscape or urban trees, this indication of climate vulnerability. And it's a combination of the impacts of climate change on a tree species, and then also the adaptive capacity of those trees. And this was developed by folks at NIAX. So Matthew et al., that's the paper there that describes this. So the urban adaptability or adaptive capacity, it's based on, several dozens, I guess, of these, what they call modifying factors. And so these are factors that are related to how species respond to disturbance. So drought, flooding, pests, disease, also salt and soil and water pollution. So factors that are going to be important for urban trees. And then also life history traits. And so that's the urban adaptability. And then the impacts on climate change, what they did was they, based on a lot of different kind of data and literature, they looked at tree species ranges and compared that to the current and projected heat and hardiness zones for our area, for Washington, D.C. And they combined all of that into a list that we now have access to. And so this is just a screenshot of what that list looks like. And you can see other cities have this as well. And it indicates vulnerability to climate change in kind of a scoring, kind of a ranking, depending on low or high emission scenario. And then the adaptability is here as well. And so we were interested in applying that to our tree inventory and kind of figuring out how vulnerable are we, our trees. And I've labeled this as preliminary findings, just because when you do this, there are all sorts of decisions you need to make. So one of the biggest initial decisions you need to make is, okay, how are we going to treat cultivars? And there are lots of questions that come up like that. So this could change. And we also could look at adaptability and, so this just shows the climate change vulnerability of our street tree population under the high emission or low emission scenarios. And what you can see is that that gray wedge, those are 50% of our entire street tree population that don't have matching climate change data. And it could just be, it's like a unique species that they just didn't have a ranking for. And so, but if you look at which trees fall into that moderate high categories, it's not too bad. I mean, for the low emission scenario, that's 10% of the trees, goes up to 25% for the high emission scenario. And so, considering that we have this range potentially of 10 to 25% of our street trees, how do we address that? How might we change that? And so we wanted to look at our planting. And there's this really nice, as I mentioned, this online training. So all of it, not quite all of us, but as many people that could kind of spend the time, every week we met, there was an online class, and then we had another day that we spent kind of working on the homework. So these are my coworkers that worked on that. And so this is the kind of the process, all the steps that it takes you through, and the adaptation workbook. And there's some sources of that, some really good resources that we had. Climate Ready DC, that's a climate change plan that Department of Energy and the Environment produced. So we relied heavily on that. And we focused on the street tree population. And so this is just an example of kind of one of the goals and then one of the objectives. And so we wanted to revise our street tree planting list. And the interesting thing about this training is that you go in thinking it's all about climate change, but really what they want you to do is to take your, urban forest management plan or whatever resource management plan you have, and then run it through and just look and see how these different objectives that you want to achieve would be impacted by climate change. And so that's why this doesn't really refer to climate change, it's referring to increasing resilience of our street tree planting list. And we wanted to bring in as much as data as we could and kind of resources. So we also have this tool called the Pest Vulnerability Matrix it was originally designed by Latchin and McBride in 2008. And it's basically a visual tool that helps you understand vulnerability of a tree population to pests and pathogens. And so it incorporates the species or genus of trees, and then in the columns and then on the rows, those are the different pests and pathogens. And then you look at what is the interaction, how severe is that interaction between a particular host and then a pest or pathogen. And it can incorporate, species that aren't there yet, like Asian longhorn beetles, not something that we have, but was included in this. And it gives you a ranking that tells you how vulnerability of your population to pests and pathogens. And so you get a pest threat score for each tree species. And so this is a long journey, but we wanted to look at all of this data together. So in terms of making recommendations for planting, so what trees do we want to plant? So we wanted to incorporate all of that good information from NIACS in terms of vulnerability to climate change and adaptability, and then the pest vulnerability matrix information. And so we set up a series of calls. Prior to each call, all of us fill out this form, and it just breaks down like maybe 40 species, and you go in and rank it in terms of how we want to prioritize it for planting. Is it high priority, moderate or low priority? And those rankings are based on the climate change vulnerability data and other sources. So this is an example of what we would refer to when we were looking at the tree species in that online form. So we had vulnerability, the adaptability rankings, the pest threat score. And we also, when we had these conversations on these calls, it was more than just the data. It was also basically the subject matter expertise from everyone that was on the call. So that was, I think, really, really helpful, because we had several people on any given call. We'd have, a number of people that could provide their kind of years of experience interacting with different tree species. And then occasionally we also have a tree mortality study that we would occasionally reference as well. And so it's just an interesting process, because so some of the examples of subject matter expertise that came into play were that some species are hard to obtain, some species you order, you schedule planting, and then they never show up because they're too hard, they're too challenging for whatever reason for the contractors to procure. So, and there's a whole range of different kind of inputs that went into that. And again, like we had to make some decisions on how do we treat cultivars. Also, one thing that really came up was, there's an example of a park. So you see trees on the street and then trees in the park. Some species will be just perfect as long as they're in a park. But so we wanted to also capture that information as well. So we did add like another column which indicated whether or not a ranking was conditional. And so we had about 200 tree species and cultivars, and we ended up going through about 100 of them. But I will say that the remaining trees mostly are cultivars. So we did get through a good amount of the tree species are on our list. And what this shows is recommendations. So when we got together, we had to make a decision based on the online survey, whether or not we wanted to increase the frequency that we are planting a species. We want to kind of maintain it or pull back on planting a particular tree. And so it was about the same for kind of maintaining and reducing levels. And then about 27% of the trees, people decided that they wanted to increase those species. And what I've shown here on the left is just a snapshot. So, we have 100 trees, and it was hard to show all of them, but for example, of trees that people were interested in planting more of. And again, this is all based on the climate change vulnerability and adaptability, and then the pest vulnerability, and then subject matter expertise. And so next steps. So this is another version of the kind of urban heat island mapping that was done. So we are working on updating a tree species list that we will share with the public, so that when we're talking to people about what trees they're interested in planting, or if we want to share with them the characteristics of a particular tree that we are that day planting, then we will have this list to share with them. And we would like to include that NIAC's climate change vulnerability rankings in that. There's a whole separate list that they provided, but we do want to incorporate that into our updated tree list. And then this interest of the push to kind of implement, so we have recommendations, we want to put them into practice. We have in addition to the climate vulnerability, we also want to consider biodiversity goals and how that biodiversity goal would change across the city. So of course, the composition of trees changes depending on where you are. And then also urban heat island and heat sensitivity. So this is a big challenge, but we want to do this in some sort of map form so that we can have it when we're out and scheduling a tree planting. So we can look on a map that gives us some indication of what trees we should not plant just because there are already too many of them, and relate that to biodiversity goals, and then also which trees are best suited for where we are in terms of climate, and then where the trees are needed most as well. So incorporating that the urban heat island and heat sensitivity. And we have even more data that we'll be working with soon. So we have an urban tree canopy analysis, which is conducted every 5 years or so. And that is being kind of processed right now. And so that's being conducted by Planet Geo. And we reached out to American Forests to ask if they would work with us and kind of with Planet Geo so that we could calculate the tree equity score and address tree equity using the same criteria that American Forests does. And they were very open to that. So Planet Geo and folks in American Forests are working now on that, on incorporating that, and that will be part of our reporting and our analysis and what we share, and then would help guide our management. And then we have the urban forest inventory and analysis data, which that's started, but it's not fully complete. So sometime in the near future, we should get the completed set data, complement of data, and we can look at forest composition across the city and look at vulnerability to climate change across the city, not just our street tree population. And with that, I will end. And I just want to thank you for listening and making it through all those text heavy slides. And thank you to all of my coworkers in Urban Forestry Division for all of the calls that we've had talking through like each individual species and like looking at the data in the spreadsheets. And Department of Energy and the Environment for the Climate Ready DC plan and all of the great resources we've been able to use from the Forest Service and from NIAX. And I just listed my contact info here. I can put that in the chat too. So.
Thank you so much. And Kasey, we have enough time. We have 15 minutes for questions. Might be nice if you could stop sharing your screen and we could all sort of see each other.
Yeah,
if you find the button for that.
I've found it. It just seems to keep asking me what else I want to share. So let me there it is. It's in red. I got it.
Fantastic. Okay. And you can always return to your slides if there's a question people have. That was fantastic. We had a couple of conversations going on in the chat window. Kasey, I don't know if there's anything that caught your attention.
Yeah. Let me scroll down through.
So I did want to shout out, sorry, Kasey, that last month, and if for those of you who weren't able to make it, we were joined by Mark Majeski, and he shared with us the work of Urban FIA. And I think a lot of us didn't know about it and didn't know about the extent of the work that the U.S. Forest Service is doing. So that's really exciting to see that that hard work is actually, informing your work in DC.
Yeah, we're excited to be able to use that and to share it.
Sorry, go ahead, Kasey.
No problem. So Frank from the Kakapen Institute asked Kasey, if you can share a link to the heat index study, and wasn't sure if that was from NOAA or another organization.
So the heat sensitivity or the urban heat island mapping?
Urban heat island mapping, I think.
Okay.
It was early on when you showed the bee honeycomb map alongside the heat index map.
Okay, so that is actually
where you were planting and what the heat levels were.
Yeah, that is in a paper by Vivek Shandas, and I think it was from 2019. I can find that and share that. Yeah.
Thank you.
If you send that link to me, I can send it out with the recording from today's presentation as well.
Okay.
Thanks. I've got some board members that live in DC and they'll be fascinated by that.
Yeah, it's, I mean, 17 degrees is a lot.
Yeah.
There was a question about diversity across municipalities and how cities are thinking about that. So when we work in Boston, how's Cambridge, or Newton and another, how's their coordination? I heard a talk at Partners for Community Forestry a couple of years ago where there was a researcher at Yale who was looking at that very issue. And then Dexter kindly found the link for her paper. It was Donica, thank you, Dexter. And the link is there, a study around planting only in Northeast, which I guess is good for this group, looking at how different municipalities, what species they're planting. I'm wondering, Kasey, if you have anything further to add on that issue.
Yeah, so I can mostly just add that we've been talking about it a lot, but we haven't come to any conclusions. So ideally what we want to think about is, you can think about, there's different scales that you can think of diversity. And so we do want to think of diversity at a smaller scale, at kind of a neighborhood scale, and figure out some way to, we have the full tree inventory, street tree inventory at least, and figure out some way to kind of, if you're the urban forester in a given area, have a map open that will show you, that will, for a given radius of where you are, kind of which trees are overrepresented and underrepresented, and then have that guide your planting selections. So I think that's kind of one of the ideas that we've talked about, and incorporating that into a map that includes all the others that's kind of a challenge. So I was actually partially interested in sharing this just to see what people thought, if there were anyone who's tried, incorporating kind of the diversity, but then also the, other factors that influence kind of success and performance, like the vulnerability to climate change, that sort of thing. So that's what we're trying to do. Ideally, we want to have all of that together so that it helps you make that the best choice for your planting. And it's kind of getting to be more critical now because we have fewer and fewer places to plant. So we're almost at full stocking levels. And so, the opportunities for choosing those trees are kind of getting less. But on park and school properties, that's like the new frontier kind of, in a way.
A final frontier.
Well, I think the final frontier would be private property, but we are not able to go plant there, but we have programs to encourage trees planted on private property and support that.
I know in Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh Shade Tree Commission put out a recommended planting list. There's a recommended planting list for streets. There's a recommended planting list for parks and open spaces. And then there's like a not recommended list for trees that are overplanted or are ash trees that are victims of pests and disease. And it doesn't take into consideration specifically climate adaptability. There hasn't been a study, as far as I know, in Pittsburgh that deals specifically with climate adaptability, but some related factors like susceptibility to salts or how well they tolerate different amounts of water and that kind of thing. Those are included, so potentially that could be used as a proxy. So I know that work has been done in Pittsburgh. I think that Philadelphia also put out a similar recommended tree list, and New York did as well. So again, not specifically climate adaptability, but maybe could be interpreted in that way with some thought.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you have a given tree species that is intolerant to, of pollution and salt and has all of these kind of challenges, it's going to make it just that much harder to potentially deal with changes, crazy rain events or drought in the future. So yeah, I think the ability of a tree to be kind of resilient to disturbance would be something that would be important for looking at climate change responses.
Dexter?
Yeah, a few quick comments and then a question. The first comment is, there's already so many constraints on species lists and attempts to diversify and survivability, and I just commend you and your team for adding the climate and urban heat island lens on top of that. And I'm just really impressed that you're able to navigate yet another set of constraints and challenges. And then my second comment was Mike Alonso at American University has been using the data that went into Shondess's urban heat island interpolation surface, the direct observations, not the modeled outcome, and looking at tree canopy coverage, and that paper is making its way through peer review, but they're finding like 40% is a really important threshold for heat island cooling, like more trees cooler, but when you get to 40% coverage, it's even, the benefits are even greater. And that's consistent with a paper in Madison, Wisconsin, and then also consistent with some preliminary work I've done in New Haven. So there's a lot of work in the heat island space and trees, and 40% coverage, which is your district-wide goal, seems to be supported by the heat island benefits in particular. And then after all those comments, my question, it's kind of a sad question, but things are getting hotter and faster, and you're changing the species palettes in anticipation of that. But What if it's not successful? What if it gets hot so fast that the trees can't make it?
Yeah, I think we would just have the simplest, a smaller list. I mean, you know, we might have to rely more on some of the non-native species that are very kind of urban, tolerant of urban conditions. And yeah, I mean, we need to have trees in our cities. So I think that's, so not just like not having them is not an option, but perhaps, you know, there could be a more intense management regime that you undertake for establishment, focusing, you know, on that. Not that we already have our trees watered, you know, for 2 years during the summer, but yeah, so you know, it's possible. Hopefully that doesn't happen, but yeah.
Sorry to offer such a downer question.
Well, I'll go back to the 40%. I'm excited to see that paper. I think I've heard that before from is it Carly Zeider? I think some of her work. So yeah, so that's good to hear, and especially if that's local, it'd be great to see that as well.
She's at Concordia now, if I'm not mistaken, in Canada.
Yeah, she did her
Canada.
PhD in Wisconsin and is now in Montreal. Yeah, Concordia.
Yeah.
All right, so in our last 5 minutes, we have a couple more questions. We'll try to get them
Yes.
in.
CA
I
Barth?
see Frank raising your hand. There's one in the chat from Carolyn and Marcus, and then there's another question from Clara. So let's try to get those 3 in. Go ahead, Frank.
Well, there's CA Barth had, and I've forgotten your name. She had her hand up for a while. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I didn't see that.
Yeah.
So I'm particularly interested in combining the adaptability with those species that are most supportive of the biodiversity, that support our pollinators. It's, I'm an ecologist actually. So, and the other piece of that is, I know in the forest maps that they made a judgment for how trees might be able to shift their range naturally or not. And here in the Mid-Atlantic, we have, and particularly in Maryland, we have a lot of disjunct species. We just do. And so for me, I think one, I really want to find a way that we can combine that ecological bang for the buck with adaptability and push hard on those. And then the other thing is, I think we need to be talking about the notion of, are there southern species that we should help move, like they're doing in Minnesota? And whether, particularly in our built environment, where it's not so much that we're trying to put them out there in the wild, but we're trying to help that movement. Naturally, plants move a lot more than we give them credit for. My background's paleoecology, but as with everything else, we've kind of messed that system up a bit.
Yeah, I think.
And out there, if other people are interested in this, I would love to put our heads together.
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely thinking, I didn't mention all of the, every single kind of factor that would go into these decisions, but certainly considering wildlife benefits is very important to us. If you love birds, then you should be concerned about trees because they're providing, they're supporting insects. And so, yeah, we're definitely thinking about what tree species might fare well here that are that typically have more southern ranges. And the nice thing about, working in urban forestry is that we don't need our trees to reproduce. we don't need to be concerned about regeneration, because we are planting the trees. So that's something that can be kind of taken out of the equation in terms of whether or not these tree species can extend their range or persist in a broader range.
Kasey, was it Frank next? We have another question. Frank, go ahead.
You can hold off. My question was about salt water, so it probably doesn't affect anybody else. So go ahead with a different question.
You're in West Virginia. It doesn't affect you either. Any other questions? We're hitting 11 o'clock.
Yeah, I mean, I see there's a question about how long did it take?
Yes, thank you.
So, yeah, the adaptation workbook was a training that was, I guess, 2.5 months or so. So it's 2.5 months through that training. The conversations we had once we got the actual raw data, that was over a couple months as well. And then definitely time in between that. So, we started 2020 right before the lockdown. And then in this past year, we had the conversations about which trees we want to prioritize for planting. So it doesn't really have to take that long, but other work happens too.
I had a question, and if you have to go, Kasey, I totally understand.
I'm good.
Okay, and so it is 11 o'clock if people need to go. We'll see you next month. So what and I'm speaking now as the head of a nonprofit. And I know DC has a very strong nonprofit. One thing that wasn't in your presentation was Kasey Trees, and I'm wondering, the relationship that you all have with Kasey Trees and how that has informed your work. Because I think a lot of us here are actually representing nonprofits. So it'd be interesting to hear what's been helpful in that relationship. What have been some of the obstacles as a lot of us work and try to figure out sort of the black box of municipal functionality and dysfunctionality, and our own functionality and dysfunctionality, and how we can sort of, we all want to row in the same way. We all have the same goals, right? We all have, I think, the same values, but we're coming at it from different places.
Yeah, I don't know how they're not in the presentation, to be honest, because there's actually a lot that we work with them a lot and we benefit from their work greatly. The advocacy work that they do. I mentioned the urban forest inventory and analysis. That's kind of replacing the iTree Eco that they used to do. So we still refer back to that and their work with iTree Eco and giving us an idea of forest composition. We still rely on that. So until the urban FIA comes into play, then we're still looking at those data. And we rely on them to also kind of be a public face for us in some ways as well, just because they have really great exposure. And so, they are helping kind of share the kind of a gospel of trees. And sometimes it's nice to not have it. If you're not from the government, people might be more receptive to you because you're not there to manage or tell them about regulations. So they can work really well with the public. And then they help administer programs to get trees on private property. So that's like a really important partnership with them. So they administer that also through DOE's River Smart Homes program. And so that's a big benefit is having them help get trees on private space, because that's where the biggest opportunity is at this point.
Great, thank you.
David, this is Frank. I'll go now. I know, and for folks who are still on, it occurs to me that Boston and New York might actually be interested in. Are there any cities that are concerned? Kasey briefly mentioned saltwater intrusion in Maryland's eastern shore. Are there any cities concerned about that, or do you think you're far enough inland that the water is not brackish enough?
I mean, I can speak for Boston as we're deeply concerned because half of our city is landfill. And we're gonna, and we're on the bay and we're gonna face a lot of flooding. So what that means for the trees, I don't know if anyone's fully figured that out yet. I think we're just, there's so many, and I think one thing, Kasey, that you bring up so powerfully is there's so many competing factors in how you select trees and plant them and care for them in a changing climate. Things like, increased temperature, increased precipitation, the salt water. Like, there is no perfect tree. That's the truth. And even if there were, we couldn't plant it because then you'd have a monoculture. So I think it's a really good question, Frank and Kasey. I don't know if you have additional thoughts on that issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Delaware, is experiencing saltwater intrusion. I don't know if that's kind of an urban forest issue for them really, but the National Park Service manages all of the cherry trees on the tidal basin in the mall, and they're definitely going to have to deal with rising sea level, like in the tidal basin there. With the cherry trees. And so, that's definitely going to be an issue in that part of the city. And then we have other flooding issues through creeks and the watershed. But yeah, so, but I'm sure other states have their own issues in terms of rising sea levels.
Quick addition to that is that one of the big mortality studies post Sandy in New York was mortality from saltwater. It wasn't intrusion per se, it was saltwater flooding, right? But in Red Maple versus, I think it was London Plain.
Yasha, you beat me to it. I just put the link in the chat. And
sorry, Dexter.
Inundation is a different animal from intrusion, but I had the exact same thought. So thank you.
I mean, we just could start planting mangroves, right? Well, with that, I know we're over time. Kasey, thank you so much. Where's my colleague? There she is, Kenzie. We'll see you all. Who's speaking again next month, Kenzie? I'm sorry.
Erica Smith-Fishman at Tree Philly, Philadelphia Parks and Recreation.
And if I'm not mistaken, I think we have someone scheduled for August, and then in September, starting in September, we're still looking for anyone to present. So if you know of anyone, or if you're interested in presenting September, October, November, December, pretty easy to do, right, Kasey?
Yep, it was good. Even, my dog behaved even, so it was great.
Thank you. The trees, thank you, and enjoy this beautiful day. We have a great one here in Boston, and I hope it's cool where you are. So
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Great to
thank
see
you.
everybody. See you next month.